In a dusty Montana town in 1876, a quiet cowboy with a war-damaged leg limped into an auction looking only for fence wire. What he found instead was something that would haunt any decent man. Two terrified native girls, shackled and being sold alongside a starved horse to cruel ranchers who made no secret of their intentions. He had only $9 to his name. Buying them meant losing money he couldn't afford and gaining the hatred of the most powerful rancher in the territory. But when he saw the older girl's eyes, empty of hope, full of survival instinct, shielding her younger sister, he couldn't walk away. He raised his hand and bid everything he had. What he didn't know was that this single act of conscience would bring armed men to his door, threaten everything he owned, and force him to choose between his safety and their lives. And what happened next would prove that sometimes the bravest thing a broken man can do is try. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from. The sun hung high over Bridges Crossing that August morning, baking the dirt streets into dust that rose with every boot step and wagon wheel. The town square had drawn its usual collection of faces, ranchers in sweat-stained hats, drifters with empty pockets and hungry eyes, merchants looking for bargains they could flip for profit. They gathered around the wooden auction platform like vultures circling something dying. And in a way, that's exactly what they were. The auctioneer, a thin man named Carlisle with a voice like rusted nails, worked through his inventory with practiced efficiency. Cattle, farm equipment, a wagon with a broken axle. Then he gestured to something that made the crowd lean forward with a different kind of interest. Next lot, Carlisle announced, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Appaloosa mare, approximately 6 years old. Confiscated from a hostile camp cleared 2 weeks back up near the Judith Basin. The horse stood with her head low, ribs pressing against her spotted coat like the bars of a cage. Scars crisscrossed her flanks, whip marks, recent ones. Her eyes held the dull glaze of an animal that had stopped expecting anything but pain. But it wasn't the mare that held the crowd's attention. Beside her, connected to the lead rope by a length of chain, stood 2 girls. The older one couldn't have been more than 14, the younger perhaps 10. Both wore the remnants of hide dresses, torn and filthy from weeks of captivity. Their wrists were shackled with iron cuffs that had rubbed the skin raw. The older girl stood in front of the younger one, her body a shield, her face carefully empty of expression. But her eyes moved constantly, cataloging exits, counting men, measuring distances she could never cross in chains. Now, these here come with the mare, Carlisle continued, his tone as casual as if he were describing a pair of saddlebags. Part of the lot, per territorial confiscation laws. Indian girls, healthy enough, young enough to train up for work. Kitchen labor, stable work, whatever use you got for 'em. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Someone called out, "They house-trained, Carlisle." More laughter. The older girl's expression didn't change, but her shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. The younger one pressed her face against her sister's back. "Bidding starts at $5 for the lot," Carlisle said. "Horse and both girls. $5. A rancher near the front raised his hand, grinning at his neighbor. "Hell, the horse alone's worth that, even half dead." $6. Another voice, this one belonging to a man in a fine wool vest, a merchant, probably, thinking about profit margins. $6.50. The first rancher again, not willing to be outbid. Jack Brennan stood at the back of the crowd, a canvas sack of fence wire over one shoulder and a hat pulled low against the glare. He'd come to town for supplies, nothing more. Coffee, wire, maybe a new file if the general store had one that wasn't pure rust. He didn't come to town often, once a month at most, and he never stayed longer than he had to. Towns had too many people, too many questions, too many memories of things he'd rather forget. But he couldn't walk away from this. His jaw tightened as the bidding climbed. $7 now. The crowd was enjoying itself, men nudging each other and speculating loudly about what work the girls might be good for. The words made Jack's stomach turn. He'd heard words like that before, in other places, other times. He'd heard them right before things happened that kept him awake at night 12 years later. The older girl's eyes swept the crowd again, and for just a moment, they locked on Jack's. There was nothing pleading in that gaze. No hope. Just the flat, exhausted assessment of a creature that had learned the hard way that all hands eventually became fists. $7 going once, Carlyle called. The bid had come from a man Jack recognized. Voss, the foreman from the Pritchard Ranch. A hard man who worked for a harder one. Both of them known for burning through workers and discarding them when they broke. Voss was grinning, already counting his purchase as good as done. The crowd was losing interest. The horse was too damaged. The girls likely too traumatized to be worth the trouble of breaking in. Going twice. Jack's hand went up before he could think better of it. $9. The crowd turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Carlyle blinked, shading his eyes to see who'd spoken. That you, Brennan? Someone called. Didn't know you were in the market for $9, Jack repeated, louder this time. His voice carried the flat authority of a man who'd once given orders on battlefields and wasn't interested in debate. Vossi's grin faded. He looked like he might counter, but Pritchard wasn't here to authorize spending more on what was clearly a charity case. He spat into the dirt and turned away, muttering something about fools and their money. $9. Then, Carlyle said, clearly glad to be done with a lot that was generating more talk than profit. Sold to Jack Brennan. Jack limped forward. His left leg still carried the memory of a mini ball that Confederate surgeons couldn't quite extract, and counted $9 silver from his steel bag into Carlyle's palm. The auctioneer handed him the lead rope without ceremony, without a word of instruction or warning, as if passing over a broken tool. Jack took the rope. The May flinched but didn't pull away. She'd learned that pulling away only brought more pain. He looked at the older girl. She stayed back at him with that same flat wariness, her body still positioned protectively in front of his sister. She was waiting for him to speak, to command, to show his true intentions now that money had changed hands and she belonged to him in the eyes of every man present. Jack said nothing. He just turned and started walking toward the edge of town, the mare following on the rope, the two girls trailing behind because the chain left them no choice. Behind them, the auction continued. Carlyle's voice rose again, hawking the next lot. The crowd's attention had already moved on. But the older girl's eyes stayed on Jack's back, watching his every move, waiting for the moment when the mask would drop and the real man would show himself. She'd learned to wait for that moment. It always came. The walk out of Bridges Crossing was silent except for the crunch of boots on dirt and the labored breathing of the half-starved mare. Jack led them east, away from the main road, toward a trail that cut through pine hills and sage flats. His own horse, a sturdy bay gelding, followed on a tether behind him. The two girls walked at the end of the chain, their bay feet leaving small prints in the dust. Jack didn't look back at them. He didn't speak. He just walked, steady and slow, favoring his bad leg on the uphill stretches. The older girl, though Jack didn't know her name yet, didn't know anything about her except what he'd seen on that auction block, kept her eyes on the horizon, on the tree line, on anything that might offer a path to run. But running required opportunity, and opportunity required weakness. So far, this man showed neither. He moved with the careful economy of someone used to pain, someone who'd learned to work around limitations. The rifle across his back was old but clean. The way he held the lead rope was firm but not cruel. She didn't trust any of it. 3 weeks ago, she had a name. Iona, meaning eternal blossom, given to her by a father who believed his daughters would outlive the dying world around them. 3 weeks ago, she had a home, not a place, but a people. A small band of 23 souls camped in a hidden valley where a creek ran cold and clear, where the hills broke the wind, where they thought they might be forgotten long enough to survive. They weren't part of any war. They hadn't ridden with the warriors who'd struck back against broken treaties and stolen land. They were simply trying to exist in the shrinking spaces between white expansion and extinction. Her father, Two Hawks, was a man of peace born into a time that had no use for peace. He taught his daughters to speak 3 languages, their own, Crow for trading, and enough English to negotiate when negotiation was still possible. He taught them that survival meant being invisible, being useful, being smart enough to know when to bend and when to run. He taught them everything except how to survive without him. The cavalry came at dawn on a morning that had started like any other. Iona had been helping her younger sister, Nuna, braid her hair by the fire when the first shouts rang out. Soldiers on horseback, blue uniforms dark in the early light, surrounding the camp with rifles raised. No warning, no parley, just orders barked in English that most of the elders didn't fully understand. Two Hawks stepped forward, hands raised and empty, speaking in careful English. "We are peaceful. We have no weapons. We only want to live." The lieutenant, a young man with a thin mustache and eyes that darted like a spooked horse, shouted something about hostiles and orders and clearing the territory. Two Hawks kept his hands up, kept his voice calm, kept trying to make the man see that there were only elders and children here. No warriors, no threat. The shot came so suddenly that Iona didn't understand what had happened at first. Her father stumbled backward, a red stain spreading across his chest. He looked down at it, confused, as if his body had betrayed him. Then he fell. Iona screamed. Nuna screamed. The world became chaos, soldiers shouting, elders weeping, children being dragged from their mother's arms. Iona threw herself over her father's body, begging him to get up, to breathe, to be alive. But the light was already leaving his eyes. He reached for her hand, squeezed it once, and then he was gone. The lieutenant stood over them, his pistol still smoking. He reached for a weapon, he said, loud enough for his men to hear. You all saw it. No one had seen it. There was no weapon. But it didn't matter what was true. It only mattered what could be written in a report. The survivors were divided like livestock. The elders, those too old to be useful, were loaded onto wagons bound for a reservation 200 miles south, a place Iona had heard described as a dying ground where the government sent people it wanted to forget. The children were declared wards of the territory, which meant they belonged to whoever could pay the processing fees. Everything else, horses, blankets, tools, anything that could be sold, was confiscated to offset the cost of pacification operations. Iona and Nuna were taken to Bridges Crossing and locked in a pen behind the marshal's office. It was a space meant for livestock, not people. There was no roof, no privacy, no kindness. They were fed once a day, stale bread and water, and left to huddle together through cold nights. Men came to look at them, discussing their potential value the way farmers discuss mules. Some of the comments made Iona pull Nuna closer and wish for a weapon she didn't have. At night, when Nuna cried, Iona whispered to her in their language. She promised they would survive. She promised they would escape. She promised their father was watching over them from the spirit world. She didn't believe any of it. But Nuna needed to believe, so Iona lied. Now, walking behind this silent man with the limp and the weathered face, Iona calculated. He hadn't spoken to them, hadn't touched them, hadn't even looked at them since taking the rope. That could mean restraint, or it could mean he was waiting until they were alone, away from witnesses. She'd learned that men wore masks in public. The real face came out later, in private, when there was no one to stop them. She would not let him hurt Nuna. Whatever he planned to do, she would take it first. She would fight if she could, endure if she couldn't, and run if she found a moment. But she would not let him touch her sister. Jack, walking ahead, felt the weight of their eyes on his back. He knew what they were thinking. He'd seen that look before, in other places, on other faces. It was a look of people who'd learned that survival meant expecting the worst and being right more often than not. He didn't blame them. He was a stranger who'd bought them like property because that's what the law said they were. He hadn't asked their names, hadn't asked if they wanted to come with him, hadn't given them any reason to trust that he was different from the men who'd caged them or the ones who'd killed their people. And the truth was, he wasn't sure he was different. Not in the ways that mattered. 12 years ago, Jack had worn a uniform. He'd been a cavalry scout for the Union Army, riding ahead of columns, mapping terrain, identifying threats. He was good at it, good enough that they kept promoting him, kept giving him more responsibility, kept sending him into situations that required someone who could think fast and shoot straight. Then came the winter of '64, and the orders that ended his career. A peaceful Cheyenne camp along Sand Creek. Elders, women, children. No warriors. Just people trying to survive a war they hadn't started. The major in charge called them hostiles. Called it a necessary action. called it protecting white settlers from savage violence. Jack had refused the order. He'd told the major it was murder, not war. The major had him beaten by 2 sergeants and thrown in a stockade. From his cell, he'd heard the gunfire. Later, he'd heard the stories. Over 100 dead, most of them women and children. Mutilated bodies. Trophies taken. He'd been discharged for insubordination and cowardice. Stripped of rank, marked as unreliable, sent back to civilian life with nothing but shame and memories that wouldn't fade. He tried to outrun them. Drifted west, found work on ranches, saved enough to buy a small piece of land in the Montana foothills. He built a cabin, ran a few head of cattle, kept to himself. He didn't talk about the war, didn't talk about Sand Creek, didn't talk about the faces he still saw when he closed his eyes at night. But when he'd seen those 2 girls on the auction block, chained and terrified, he'd seen those faces again. The children he hadn't saved. The ones who died because he wasn't strong enough or brave enough to do more than refuse an order. He'd bought the girls because he couldn't walk away. Not again. But he had no plan beyond that. No idea what came next. No legal right to keep them safe, and no power to protect them if someone with authority decided to take them back. He'd spent $9 he couldn't afford on 2 lives he didn't know how to save. All he knew was that he had to try. The sun climbed higher as they walked. The trail wound through stands of pine and opened onto long stretches of grassland. Jack stopped once to let the mare drink from a creek, and he filled his canteen and offered it to the girls. Iona took it, let Nuna drink first, long and deep, then took a small sip herself and handed it back without meeting his eyes. Jack nodded, capped the canteen, and kept walking. Behind him, Iona watched his back and waited for the moment when everything would change. It always did. The ranch appeared in the late afternoon light like something out of a half-remembered dream. Small, worn, but standing. A cabin with a stone chimney and a roof that sagged slightly on one side. A barn weathered gray by years of wind and sun. A corral with split-rail fencing that had been mended more times than rebuilt. 2 horses, both looking better fed than the Appaloosa, lifted their heads to watch the strange procession arrive. A creek ran through a grove of cottonwoods at the eastern edge of the property, the sound of moving water audible even from a distance. Hills rose on 3 sides, pine-covered and steep, creating a pocket of land that felt both sheltered and isolated. No other buildings were visible. No smoke from neighboring chimneys. No roads except the trail they'd walked. Jack stopped at the corral and tied the mare's lead rope to a post. She stood there, head down, too exhausted to do anything but breathe. The girls stood where the chain left them, still connected to the mare, their eyes scanning the property for what came next. Jack finally spoke, his voice rough from hours of silence. "Need to get those off you." He gestured to the shackles. Iona's body went rigid. She'd heard men say they needed to help before, usually right before hands went places they shouldn't. She stepped in front of Nuna, her face carefully blank but her muscles coiled to fight or run, whichever became necessary first. Jack saw the shift. He stopped moving, keeping his distance. "I don't have the key," he said slowly. "Have to file them off. It'll take time. You can see my hands the whole time." "I won't." He paused, searching for words that might mean something to girls who'd learned words were just another kind of lie. "I won't hurt you." He waited. When neither girl moved or responded, he went into the barn and came back with a metal file and a short piece of wood. He set them on the ground between himself and the girls, then backed away several steps. "You can come when you're ready," he said. "Or I can leave the file and you can try it yourselves, but those irons are thick. Might take days without help." He turned his attention to the mare, running his hands along her neck, speaking in a low, steady murmur that wasn't quite words, just sound meant to soothe. The horse's ears flicked toward him, uncertain but not panicked. Iona watched him work, watched how he moved, slow, predictable, giving the damaged animal time to understand he wasn't a threat. She'd seen men handle horses before. Most used force when the animal resisted. This man used patience. After several long minutes, she made a decision based not on trust but on calculation. The shackles were heavy, the metal chafing wounds that were starting to show signs of infection. They couldn't run far in chains. They couldn't defend themselves. And if this man wanted to hurt them, he could do it whether they were shackled or not. She nudged Nuna forward. Jack glanced at them, nodded once, and gestured to a bench near the corral. Sit there. Easier to work if the iron's braced against something solid. Iona sat first, holding out her wrists. Jack knelt, not crouched, but fully knelt, putting himself lower than her, making himself vulnerable in a way that surprised her. He positioned the wood block under the chain between her wrists and began working the file against the weakest point in the iron. He didn't speak to her. He spoke to the mare, still tied nearby, his voice a constant low stream of words about nothing. The weather, the creek, the fence that needed mending. It took nearly an hour to file through the first shackle. When it finally broke, Iona's hand fell free, and she had to resist the urge to bolt. Jack moved to the second one without pause, without touching her skin, his focus entirely on the metal. When both girls were freed, Jack gathered the broken shackles and the file and stood. He pointed to the barn. You can sleep there. Hay's clean, there's space in the back corner. I'll bring food. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He just walked to the cabin, his limp more pronounced now after kneeling on hard ground for so long, and disappeared inside. Iona stood frozen for a moment, then grabbed Nuna's hand and moved quickly toward the barn. Inside, it smelled of hay and old wooden horses. There were stalls on one side, currently empty except for old leather tack hanging on pegs. The back corner had a pile of clean straw and enough space for two people to lie down without touching the walls. It wasn't a pen. There was no lock on the outside of the door. The windows, though high, weren't barred. Iona didn't know what to do with that information. An hour passed. Then Jack's footsteps approached, deliberate and heavy enough to be heard from a distance. He didn't enter. He simply set something on the ground outside the door and walked away. Iona waited until his footsteps faded before cracking the door open. On the ground sat a tin plate covered with a cloth, 2 wool blankets that looked old but clean, and a full canteen. She pulled them inside quickly and barred the door with a plank she'd found leaning against the wall. The plate held bread, beans, and strips of venison. Iona stared at it. Poison was possible. Drugs were possible. Kindness as a prelude to violation was almost certain. But Nuna was hungry. Iona could hear her sister's stomach growling in the silence. She inspected the food carefully, smelling it, looking for anything that seemed wrong. The bread was plain. The beans were just beans. The meat looked and smelled like venison. She made Nuna wait while she took a small bite of everything and sat for 10 minutes, monitoring her body for any strange sensations. Nothing happened. Finally, she let Nuna eat. They finished everything on the plate because they didn't know when the next meal would come, if it would come, if this was a test or a trap or just a calm before something was. When they were done, Iona arranged the blankets in the corner and pulled Nuna close. Her sister's body shook with silent sobs, the kind she'd learned to suppress during their weeks in the pen. Iona stroked her hair and whispered in their language, "We're safe now. He won't hurt us. We're going to be okay." The lies felt heavy in her mouth. She didn't sleep. She watched the door, the windows, the thin lines of light coming through gaps in the barnwood. She listened for footsteps, for the sound of the door being tested, for anything that would tell her the mask had finally dropped. Outside, Jack checked the bolt on his cabin door, then deliberately slid it closed from the outside, locking himself out. He settled onto the porch with his rifle across his lap and his back against the cabin wall. He wasn't guarding them in. He was guarding them from anything that might come looking in the night. And he was making sure they knew they could lock him out if they needed to. He didn't sleep much either. The next morning came cold and gray, dawn breaking slow over the hills. Jack was up before the light, feeding his horses, checking fence lines, carrying water from the creek. He set another plate of food outside the barn door, biscuits this time, with butter and honey, along with a fresh bucket of water. He didn't knock, didn't call out, didn't wait to see if they'd emerge. He just worked his land, his movements steady and deliberate, pretending they weren't there because pretending seemed kinder than demanding. Inside the barn, Iona cracked the door and pulled the food inside. The pattern repeated. Another day of silence. Another night of watching. Another morning of food appearing like some kind of strange ritual that made no sense in a world where nothing came without a price. By the third day, Iona was exhausted from not sleeping. Nuna had stopped crying but hadn't spoken a word since their father died. The food kept coming. The man kept his distance. No demands. No violence. No trap springing shut. It made no sense. And because it made no sense, Iona couldn't let herself believe it was real. On the fourth morning, Iona emerged from the barn while Jack was wrestling a feed barrel across the yard. The barrel was full, heavy enough that it took both hands and all his strength to roll it toward the corral. His limp was worse in the cold. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the old wound in his back stiffened when the weather turned. He moved in careful increments, favoring his left side, jaw tight with pain he wouldn't voice. Iona stood in the barn doorway and watched. She didn't offer help, didn't speak, just watched with the same calculating assessment she'd worn since the auction block, trying to understand this man through his actions since his words meant nothing yet. Jack noticed her. He glanced up once, nodded slightly in acknowledgement, then went back to work without comment. He didn't ask for help, didn't tell her to go back inside, didn't perform for her benefit. He just worked, slow and steady, until the barrel was where it needed to be. By afternoon, Iona had moved closer. She sat on the top rail of the corral fence, 30 feet away, still watching. Nuna remained in the barn, a shadow behind the cracked door, too afraid to venture further. Jack worked on mending a section of fence, replacing rotted posts with new wood he'd cut from the hills. His movements were economical, practiced. Every few minutes he'd pause to rest his leg, leaning on the post he'd just set, breathing carefully through the pain. Iona noticed everything. The way he moved, the way he didn't move, the fact that he was alone out here, no other workers, no wife, no family, just a man and his land and whatever ghosts he carried. That evening, when Jack left the food outside the barn, there were 2 plates as usual, but beside them sat a pair of boots, men's boots, worn but still solid, sizes too large for either girl but better than bare feet on cold ground. And a coat, heavy wool, patched at the elbows but clean. He didn't say anything about them, just left them there and walked away. The next morning, Iona was wearing both. The real shift came 2 days later, sudden and unplanned. The Appaloosa mare, the one from the auction, the one whose ribs still showed despite regular feeding, began thrashing in the corral. Jack had noticed her favoring her front left hoof that morning, and when he lifted it to check, he found the infection. The hoof was swollen, hot to the touch, with pus seeping from a crack in the sole. It needed cleaning, needed wrapping, needed immediate care, or the mare would go lame permanently. But the mare was panicked. Pain and fear had triggered something in her, some memory of hands that hurt instead of helped. She kicked when Jack approached, eyes rolling white, backing into the corner of the corral with nowhere left to go. Jack tried to calm her with his voice, the same low, steady murmur he'd used before. But the mare was past hearing. She lashed out with her hind legs, and Jack had to pivot fast. His bad leg couldn't make the turn. He went down hard on one knee, pain shooting up his spine sharp enough to steal his breath. The mare reared, front hooves striking air inches from his head. Then Iona was there. She didn't think about it, didn't calculate risk or reward. She just moved, slipping between the fence rails and approaching the mare from the side, her hands empty and visible, her body language soft and unthreatening. And she sang. It was a song from childhood, taught to her by her father when she was small enough to ride in front of him on the same Appaloosa her band had raised from a foal. A song in her language, rhythmic and low, the kind of sound that bypassed the thinking part of a brain and went straight to something older, something that remembered safety before the world turned cruel. The mare's ears flicked toward her. The wild rolling stopped. The hooves came down. Iona kept singing, kept moving closer, until she could place one hand on the mare's neck. The horse shuddered but didn't pull away. Iona stroked her, still humming, and gradually the mare's breathing slowed. "Hold her head," Jack said quietly, getting to his feet with visible effort. "Keep her steady." Iona positioned herself at the mare's head, both hands on the halter now, her voice a continuous low hum. Jack worked quickly, cleaning the infected hoof with water and carbolic, scraping out the rot, packing it with cloth soaked in medicine that smelled sharp and bitter. The May flinched but didn't kick. Iona held her, sang to her, reminded her that not all hands brought pain. When it was done, Jack wrapped the hoof and straightened slowly, his back protesting every movement. He looked at Iona, really looked at her, not the wary glance of someone trying not to spook a frightened creature, but the direct gaze of one person acknowledging another. "You're good with her," he said. Iona said nothing, but something in her posture shifted, some small release of tension she'd been carrying for so long it had become part of her skeleton. The routine changed after that. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but the walls began to crack in small, deliberate ways. Iona started helping with the horses. She was skilled. Jack could see she'd grown up around them, knew their language, their needs, their moods. Nuna began venturing out of the barn, staying close to her sister but watching everything with huge dark eyes. Jack taught them through demonstration, not words, how he fed the horses, how he checked their hooves, how he mucked stalls and mended tack. They ate meals on the porch steps now, the girls on one side, Jack on the other, plates balanced on knees, no one speaking but the silence less hostile than before. Jack still slept on the porch. The girls still locked the barn door from inside. But the distance between them had narrowed from a canyon to a creek. Jack learned their names by accident. Nuna whispered hers one afternoon while petting the nose of a young foal, the first word she'd spoken since the auction. Jack heard it and filed it away, then started using both names when he needed to, quietly, respectfully, the way he'd address any person who'd earned the basic dignity of their identity. The world expanded on a Tuesday afternoon when a rider approached from the North Trail. Jack tensed immediately, his hand moving toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail. But Iona recognized the figure before he did, a woman, riding alone, a basket tied to her saddle. Clara Hewitt was a widow in her 50s who ran the neighboring ranch with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to do 10 jobs after her husband died and left her with land to manage and no patience for excuses. She'd heard the rumors. The whole county had heard the rumors by now. Jack Brennan bought himself some Indian girls at auction. The specifics varied depending on who was telling it, but the implications were always ugly. She'd come to see for herself. Clara dismounted with the stiffness of someone who'd spent too many years in the saddle, tied her horse, and walked toward the porch with eyes that missed nothing. She saw 2 girls in clean clothes, boots that didn't fit but were worn anyway, helping with ranch work that looked voluntary, not forced. She saw Jack standing at a careful distance, his posture defensive but not aggressive. She saw a man sleeping on his own porch because the cabin was occupied by people who needed a door they could lock. Her expression shifted. She'd come prepared to confront a predator. What she found was something more complicated. "Jack Brennan," she said, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone used to being heard. "Been hearing talk? I imagine you have." Jack didn't move from his spot by the porch rail. "Pritchard's foreman, Voss, has been telling folks you stole property he intended to buy. Says he's got a claim. Says he's coming to collect what's rightfully his." Jack's jaw tightened. "They are not property." Clara studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, slow and deliberate. "I know that. You know that." She glanced at the girls, then back at Jack. "Lord doesn't." She pulled the basket from her saddle and set it on the porch. "Preserves, from the smell. I'll tell folks what I saw here. Won't stop all the talk, but it might slow it some." She turned to Iona then, speaking in careful, measured English. "You run into trouble, real trouble. My ranch is 5 miles north. You follow the creek upstream. Can't miss it. You come there. Understand? Anytime, day or night." Iona stared at her. It was the first time since her father died that an adult had spoken to her like a person instead of a problem to be solved or an object to be managed. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded. Clara mounted her horse and rode off without ceremony, leaving behind a basket of preserves and the knowledge that someone outside this ranch saw them as human. That night, the storm came. It rolled in from the west like an army, dark clouds massing over the hills, thunder announcing its arrival long before the first drops fell. Then the rain hit, Not a gentle shower, but a wall of water driven by wind that tore at the barn roof and found every gap in the old wood. Inside, Nuna began to cry. The thunder reminded her of gunfire, the flashes of lightning like muzzle flare. Iona held her, whispered reassurances, but the barn was leaking in 3 places and the cold was seeping in and her sister's crying wouldn't stop. Jack heard it from the porch. He stood, walked to the barn door, and called through the wood, loud enough to be heard over the storm. Cabin's dry. Door stays open. Your choice. He didn't wait for an answer. He went back to the porch, sat down with his back to the cabin wall, and made it clear through his position that he wasn't going inside. An hour passed. The rain intensified. Nuna's crying turned to shivering sobs. Iona made the call. She opened the barn door and led Nuna through the rain to the cabin. Jack stood as they approached but didn't move toward them. Just pointed to the bed in the corner, a simple frame with a mattress and blankets. Take the bed. I'll take the floor. Iona hesitated. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The mask dropping. The real intentions showing. But Jack just pulled a blanket from a trunk, spread it on the floor by the fireplace, and laid down with his back to them. No demands. No expectations. Just a dry place to sleep and a man who kept his word about distance even when they were all under the same roof. Iona and Nuna climbed into the bed. No one spoke. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire crackled low. The wall between them hadn't fallen, but it had cracked, and through the cracks, something like trust was beginning to seep in. 2 days after the storm, the sound of hoofbeats carried across the morning stillness like a warning. 4 riders came up the trail from town, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew they had power on their side and weren't in any hurry to prove it. Jack was at the corral when he spotted them. He recognized the lead rider immediately. Voss, Pritchard's foreman, the same man who'd been bidding at the auction. The 3 men with him had the look of hired guns, hard faces, gun belts worn low, the kind of men who got paid to make problems disappear. Jack's hand moved to the rifle leaning against the fence post. He didn't raise it, just kept it close. Iona saw them from the barn doorway. Her body went rigid, every muscle remembering what men on horses meant. Nuna was inside, feeding the barn cats Jack had never officially acknowledged but fed anyway. Iona moved to block the door, positioning herself between the approaching riders and her sister. Voss reined up 20 feet from the porch, close enough to make his presence felt but far enough to claim he wasn't trespassing. The 3 hired guns spread out slightly, a practice formation that put Jack in the middle of a triangle. Tactical, threatening without being overtly violent. Brennan, Voss said, his voice carrying false courtesy over real menace. Got some business to discuss. Jack didn't move from his spot by the corral. Don't recall inviting you onto my property. Voss pulled a folded paper from his jacket. Got a legal document. He says you interfered with a legitimate transaction. Bill of sale shows I had the winning bid on lot 17. That man, the Indian girls that came with her. Says here you stepped in after the hammer fell, disrupted the auction, and took possession of property that was rightfully purchased by Pritchard Ranch. That's a lie. Jack's voice was flat. Auctioneer called it sold to me. $9. Legal and witnessed. Funny thing about witnesses. Voss smiled, showing teeth. Most of them work for Mr. Pritchard or depend on his goodwill for their livelihoods. Sheriff's already signed off on this. Says the auction was irregular, and the original sale should stand. Jack's jaw tightened. Pritchard owned half the county through debt or intimidation. The sheriff was in his pocket. Territorial law was vague enough that whoever had the most money and influence could bend it to shape. They're under my care, Jack said. They're not going anywhere. Voss's smile widened. Your care? That what you call it? He raised his voice deliberately, making sure his words would carry. Whole town knows what you bought them for. Brennan. Man living alone buys 2 Indian girls at auction, keeps them on his property, won't let anyone see them unless it's by accident. We all know what kind of care that means. The accusation landed like a physical blow. It was designed to paint Jack as the predator, the deviant, the man who deserved whatever came next. Designed to make the community turn away, to make witnesses scarce, to isolate Jack so thoroughly that when Pritchard's men came to take what they wanted, no one would lift a finger to stop them. Inside the cabin, Iona heard every word. The shame rose in her like bile, hot and familiar. This was her fault. She'd brought this on him. She was poison. Everyone she touched, everything she came near, turned rotten. Her father had died protecting her. Jack would lose his land protecting her. She and Una were a curse that ruined decent people. She began calculating again, but this time not for escape. This time for sacrifice. If she and Una disappeared, slipped away in the night, took their chances on the road, Jack would be left alone. Voss would have no reason to come back. Jack could keep his land, his life, his reputation. It was the only kindness she could offer in return for his. Outside, Voss leaned forward in his saddle. You got until sundown to hand them over. After that, we come back with the sheriff and a legal writ. And if you resist, well, that's interfering with an officer of the law. That's a crime that costs a man his property. Jack's hand tightened on the rifle. 4 against 1. Hired guns against a man with a bad leg and no legal standing. He could fight, but fighting meant dying, and dying meant leaving the girls with no one. The calculation showed on his face. Voss saw it and smiled. Then hoofbeats sounded from the north trail. Clara Hewitt rode in fast, her 2 ranch hands flanking her, both good men, both armed. Behind them came another rider, an older man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen most of what the West had to offer and hadn't been impressed by much of it. Eli Stone, a former trapper who'd lived in these mountains for 40 years and knew every band, every tribe, every family that had been driven out or destroyed. Clara reined up between Voss and Jack, her horse dancing sideways, forcing Voss to back his mount up several steps. Her voice carried across the yard, loud and clear, the kind of volume that said she wanted every word remembered. I've been on this property 6 times in the past 2 weeks, she announced, looking directly at Voss. I've seen how Jack Brennan treats these girls, with decency and distance. I've watched them work freely, eat separately, sleep in locked quarters with him on the outside. If you're accusing him of something, Voss, say it plain and direct, because I'll ride to the territorial judge myself and testify otherwise under oath. Eli Stone moved his horse forward, his voice rough as creek gravel. Two Hawks was a good man. Knew him for 15 years. Traded with him, broke bread with him, trusted him. He was murdered for no cause by a jumpy lieutenant who lied in his report. Those girls are his daughters, and they deserve better than Pritchard's crew. The weight of their presence shifted the balance. 2 witnesses willing to testify. Respected members of the community. Clara owned land, not as much as Pritchard, but enough to matter. Eli had been here longer than most of the white settlers and carried a reputation for honesty that even corrupt sheriffs couldn't easily dismiss. Voss's expression darkened. This wasn't supposed to happen. Isolated men were easy targets. Men with community backing were harder to break. This isn't over, Voss said, his voice tight with controlled rage. Mr. Pritchard has legal counsel. He has connections. He has patience. We'll be back, Brennan. And next time, your friends might not be around to save you. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his hired guns following. The sound of hoofbeats faded into distance, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Clara dismounted, her face grim. That bought you time. Not much, but some. Pritchard's got the sheriff, but he doesn't have the judge. Not yet. Anyway, if we can get testimony to the territorial court, document what happened at that auction, prove the girls are being treated properly, there's a chance. A small chance, Eli added, but better than none. Jack nodded, his throat tight. Thank you. Clara waved it off. Thank me when it's done. Right now, you need a plan. Legal papers, witnesses, documentation. And you need to prepare for the possibility that none of it will be enough. She and Eli rode off, her ranch hands following. Jack stood alone in his yard again, the weight of his limitations pressing down like physical force. One man, a limp, no money for lawyers, no legal claim to 2 girls who weren't his kin and weren't protected by any law that mattered. That night, after the evening chores were done and the horses fed, Jack sat on the porch steps. Iona emerged from the cabin. They'd been sleeping inside since the storm, the barn abandoned in favor of space they could share with a door between them. She sat on the opposite end of the steps, the distance between them smaller than it used to be but still present. Jack spoke first, his voice low. I can't protect you if they come with the law. I don't have papers, don't have power, don't have anything but this land and my word, and neither of those count for much against men like Pritchard. He paused, the admission costing him something. I'm sorry. Iona was quiet for a long moment. She'd been planning to leave, had been ready to take Nuna and disappear into the night, to spare this man the cost of his kindness. But hearing him apologize, hearing him admit weakness instead of pretending strength he didn't have, changed something. You tried, she said, the words careful and deliberate in English that was improving daily. No one tries. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it was acknowledgement that trying mattered, that effort counted, that the difference between Jack Brennan and the men who'd killed her father and caged her like an animal was that Jack saw her as human and acted accordingly, even when it cost him. It was the first time she'd spoken more than 3 words to him. Jack nodded, not looking at her. They sat in silence as the sun set over the Montana hills, 2 broken people and a child sleeping inside, all of them caught in a system that saw them as less than they were and threatened to grind them down regardless of who was right. But for tonight, they were still here, still standing, still trying. And sometimes, that had to be enough. The final confrontation came not through violence but through persistence and witness. Clara organized a quiet campaign that moved through the county like water finding cracks in stone. Slow, patient, relentless. She and Eli rode to neighboring ranches, stood up at church gatherings, presented testimony at the territorial office about Two Hawks' murder and the auction that followed. They documented everything: the lieutenant's false report, the lack of legal authority for the confiscation, the girl's treatment in the holding pen, Jack's conduct since. It took 3 months. Pritchard pushed back with lawyers and bribes and threats. But his influence had limits, and when a new territorial judge arrived, a man with a reputation for following law instead of money, the case was reviewed. The auction was nullified on grounds of illegal seizure. The girls were declared wards without legal ownership. Jack applied for formal guardianship, backed by Clara's sworn testimony and a petition signed by 17 community members who'd witnessed his character. It was approved. The emotional resolution was quiet. Jack didn't become their father. They didn't become his daughters in any fairy-tale sense. But they stayed. Iona learned to read English from Clara's patient instruction. Nuna spoke again, softly at first, then with growing confidence. Jack taught them to ride properly, to mend fences, to handle a rifle for protection they prayed they'd never need. One evening, as the sun set over the Montana hills painting everything gold and red, Iona sat on the porch steps and told Jack about her father. His humor, his skill with horses, the way he died trying to protect people who couldn't be protected. Jack listened. Then he shared his own ghosts. The camp at Sand Creek, the screams, the guilt that woke him most nights. No grand declarations. No promises of healing. Just 2 people broken by history, choosing to walk forward together because going back was impossible and standing still was death. Nuna fell asleep between them, her head on Iona's lap. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing. But it was a start.